My father called me on a Tuesday, which was strange because my father never called. He texted single sentences. Coming Saturday, bring the girls. Truck needs alternator. Like words cost him money. So when his name lit up my phone at 6:14 a.m. while I was buttering toast for my daughters, I knew something was either broken or dying. I need you at the cabin Friday, he said. No greeting, no warmth. Dad, I've got parent-teacher conferences Friday. Nora's struggling with... Friday, Daniel, bring work gloves. He hung up. I stood in the kitchen with a butter knife in one hand, phone in the other, listening to my 7-year-old Nora sing to herself in the next room, while my 12-year-old Lily sat at the table reading with the terrifying focus she'd inherited from her grandfather. My ex-wife, Shonda, had the girls every other weekend, which meant I had them now, which meant I'd need to ask her for a swap. She'd want a reason. I didn't have one. I called him back. It rang 9 times and went to voicemail, which was full, because he'd never once checked it. This was who Warren Maddox was. A man who issued coordinates and expected you to arrive. My father had retired from the Army in 2003 after 26 years, most of it in logistics and combat engineering. He'd bought 43 acres in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky, built a cabin with his own hands, and slowly severed every connection to the modern world except a landline and a pickup truck. He wasn't a hermit. He came to Lexington for the girls' birthdays, sat stiffly through school plays, brought Nora a hand-carved wooden horse last Christmas that she slept with every night. But he was a man shaped by convictions he never explained. And the central conviction was this: the world was a system. Systems failed. And when they did, geography and preparation were the only currencies that mattered. I'd spent my adult life quietly disagreeing. I was a high school history teacher. I coached JV girls basketball. I drove a sedan. I had a therapist. Everything about my life was a gentle, deliberate departure from the architecture of his. I asked Shonda for the swap. She agreed, but not before the question I dreaded. Is your dad okay? Honestly, I have no idea. Daniel. A pause. Be careful with him. He sounded off last time he picked up the girls. Off how? Purposeful, more than usual. I didn't know what to do with that, so I put it in the drawer where I kept every complicated thing Shonda had ever said to me and drove to school. By Thursday evening, the news had started carrying a strange story out of Central Virginia. A long-term care facility outside Roanoke had been quarantined after an outbreak of what officials described as acute encephalitic aggression. 11 residents and 3 staff members had been hospitalized. The footage, grainy, shaky cell phone video reposted across every platform, showed an elderly woman in a hospital gown moving across a parking lot with a speed and rigidity that made my skin crawl. Her mouth was open. Her hands were fixed into claws. 2 orderlies tried to restrain her, and she bit through one man's forearm so cleanly you could see the white flash of bone before the camera cut. The CDC issued a Level 2 alert. Cable news assembled panels. The word rabies appeared in 17 headlines. I watched for 10 minutes, felt the familiar undertow of doom scrolling, and shut it off. Friday morning, I dropped the girls at Shonda's. Lily hugged me hard, which was unusual. She'd been watching the news too. Dad, is that thing in Virginia going to come here? No, sweetheart. Virginia's far away, and those are sick people getting help. She looked at me with Shonda's dark eyes and my father's jaw and said nothing, which was worse than arguing. I drove 3 hours southeast into the mountains with the windows down and the radio off, watching the hollows deepen and the cell signal die. toward a man who had never once said he loved me, but had never once failed to call when something was coming. The cabin sat at the head of a dead-end gravel road, 15 minutes off the state route, backed against a wooded ridge that climbed 600 feet before flattening into a sandstone shelf. My father had chosen it the way he chose everything for defensibility, drainage, and sight lines. 3 sides were wrapped in mature hardwood. The front faced a long descending meadow that gave you a quarter-mile of unobstructed view. As a kid, I'd thought it was beautiful. As an adult, I understood it was a kill zone he'd landscaped. His truck was parked at an angle near the woodshed, tailgate down, and when I pulled in beside it, I saw him immediately, 67 years old, built like a fence post, carrying a military surplus ammo can toward the tree line behind the cabin. He didn't wave. He set down the can, pulled off his gloves, and waited for me the way a foreman waits for a late shift. "You're an hour behind," he said. "Traffic in Winchester. Should have left earlier." He handed me a pair of leather work gloves. "We've got about 6 hours of daylight. Follow me." No coffee, no conversation about the girls, no mention of the news, which by now had metastasized. The Virginia facility had gone dark. A second cluster had appeared in western North Carolina, and the governor had activated the National Guard for what press briefings were calling a localized public health emergency. I'd listened to it in the car. My father, I was certain, had been listening to it for weeks. He led me 200 yards into the woods behind the cabin, uphill along a path I'd walked 100 times as a teenager. But 50 yards past the old deer stand, he turned left, off trail, through a dense laurel thicket I'd never pushed through, and into a small natural clearing against the base of the ridge. The ground here was freshly disturbed, not dug, but cleared. Leaves raked, rocks moved. A grid of shallow trenches had been scored into the earth with string and stakes, precise as a surveyor's plat. Against the rock face sat 11 sealed containers, OD green. Military nomenclature stenciled on the sides. Cases I recognized from a childhood spent on Army posts ammunition, MREs, medical supplies, water purification. And 4 longer cases I did not recognize, each padlocked, each heavy enough that he'd used a hand truck to move them. "Dad, what is this?" "What it looks like. It looks like you raided a National Guard armory. Supply auction, Camp Atterbury, 2019. Legal purchase, minus a few items I supplemented through other channels." He said this with the calm of a man reading a grocery list. "Today we bury it. Grid pattern, 18 inches deep, marked with cairns I'll teach you to read. Nothing visible from the air." I stared at the containers. My pulse was doing something I didn't like. This is about Virginia. Virginia is the first place it became visible. It is not the origin. It's been moving through livestock corridors for months. The incubation data doesn't match any known. "Stop." I held up a hand. "Stop, you're doing the thing." He looked at me with an expression I knew not anger, but the controlled patience of a man who had spent a lifetime being right in rooms that didn't want to hear it. "Daniel, I have never once asked you to believe what I believe. I am asking you to carry what I cannot carry alone. My back is failing. My left knee is bone on bone. I need a second pair of hands for one day. Tomorrow you drive home, go back to your classrooms and your basketball and your comfortable disbelief. But today, you help me bury these supplies, and you memorize where they are." I should have argued. I should have told him he was spiraling, that the thing in Virginia was a regional health crisis that would be contained by Monday, that his lifetime of preparation was a maladaptive response to a career that had shown him too much. Instead, I pulled on the gloves, because he'd said his back was failing. And that was the closest Warren Maddox had ever come to admitting he needed me. We started digging. He worked with an efficiency that made me feel like a tourist. Each container had a designated position on his grid. Each trench was cut to a specific depth with a margin for drainage. He'd pre-calculated the soil displacement, brought tarps to collect the excess, and had a plan for distributing the leftover dirt downslope where rain would naturalize it within 2 weeks. This was not a man having a paranoid episode. This was a man executing a blueprint. We buried the MRE cases first. 14 days of food for 6 people, he said, packed in nitrogen-sealed pouches rated for a decade of storage. Then the medical kit, antibiotics, surgical tools, sutures, a field trauma bag that looked like it had seen actual field trauma. Then the water purification system, a gravity-fed ceramic filter assembly he'd modified with UV sterilization. Then the ammunition, 308, 223, 12-gauge, 9mm. Thousands of rounds, sealed in vacuum bags inside the ammo cans. I didn't ask about the 4 long cases until we'd been working for 3 hours and my shoulders were burning. He opened one without being prompted. Inside, packed in foam, was an AR-15 platform rifle, broken down, oiled, with 6 loaded magazines nested beside it. "These are registered to me," he said. "Legally purchased, legally transported. If the time comes, I'll show you how to reassemble and zero each one." "I know how to shoot, Dad." "You know how to shoot paper at 25 yards with a .22 I gave you when you were 14. This is different. I'm not going to need—" "You might. That's the entire point of the word might." There was a sentence forming in my throat, something about how this was exactly the behavior Mom had described before she left. The obsessive contingency planning that had consumed every vacation, every holiday, every quiet evening, until she couldn't breathe inside his certainties anymore. But my mother had been dead for 4 years, and the argument had died with her. And he was 67 with a ruined knee, and the light was going. We finished at dusk. 18 caches in a rough grid spanning 40 yards of wooded hillside, each marked with a specific arrangement of stones that looked natural unless you knew the alphabet. He made me walk the grid 3 times. He quizzed me on each position. He drew a map on waterproof paper and handed me a copy. "Keep this somewhere that isn't your house," he said. "Where?" "Somewhere your ex-wife won't accidentally throw it away." This was the closest he'd ever come to making a joke about my divorce, and I almost smiled. Inside the cabin, he'd prepared a dinner that was startlingly human: venison stew, cornbread, a bottle of bourbon he poured 2 fingers of without asking. We sat at the pine table he'd built the year I graduated high school, and for 30 minutes it was almost normal. Almost the kind of evening I'd imagined having with him when I was younger and still believed proximity could become closeness. Then he turned on the radio. Not the news. A short-wave frequency, scratchy and hollow, and a man's voice reading numbers and coordinates in a flat Midwestern accent. My father listened without expression for 4 minutes, wrote 3 lines on a notepad, and turned it off. "What was that?" "Nothing you need to worry about tonight." "Dad, the corridor from Roanoke to Knoxville will be closed by Monday. If it jumps the valley, Lexington has 72 hours before intake systems collapse. You have the girls every other week. Next Thursday is your week. If anything changes before then, you bring them here. Not to Shonda's parents in Louisville. Here." "You're scaring me." He looked up from his notepad with eyes that were not scared, not manic, not performative. They were the eyes of a man who had spent 40 years watching systems and had seen this particular failure mode before, in other countries, under other names. Good, he said. Scared men move. Comfortable men negotiate. By the time they finish negotiating, the road is gone. I slept in my old bedroom that night. The sheets smelled like cedar and gun oil. I stared at the ceiling, a synonym, and told myself he was wrong, the way I always did, and felt the ground shifting beneath the lie. Saturday morning I drove home. The mountains gave way to rolling pasture, then the subdivisions of Lexington. And by the time I pulled into my driveway, the cabin felt like something I'd imagined. My duplex, with its small yard, the neighbor's wind chime, the recycling bin I'd forgotten to put out all of it, was aggressively normal. I showered, graded 11 papers on the Missouri Compromise, and fell asleep watching a basketball game. Sunday, the Virginia story expanded. 2 more facilities. A neighborhood in Roanoke evacuated. The footage had changed. It was no longer shaky cell phone video from a parking lot. It was helicopter shots of military vehicles on residential streets, and the sound underneath was not sirens, but something rhythmic, guttural, like a crowd chanting with broken jaws. The networks kept cutting away. The internet did not. I watched a 13-second clip that someone had posted from inside a house. Through a window, in a suburban backyard, 4 people moved in a way that was wrong in a dimension I couldn't name. They were fast but arrhythmic. Their arms didn't swing. Their heads tracked a sound source, a dog barking somewhere off-screen with a synchronized rotation that made my stomach fold. One of them hit the fence and went over it, with the mechanical indifference of water finding a gap. I closed the laptop and sat in my kitchen and breathed. Monday, the CDC upgraded to level 3. The president held a press conference using the word containment 11 times and pandemic 0 times. Schools in southwestern Virginia were closed. The governor of North Carolina declared a state of emergency for 12 counties. My father's words sat in my chest like a stone. The corridor from Roanoke to Knoxville will be closed by Monday. I checked the map. I-81 through the Shenandoah Valley was under restricted travel. Route 19 through Bluefield was listed as advisory delay. The corridor from Roanoke to Knoxville was functionally closed. He'd been off by 8 hours. I called him. No answer. I texted, "You were right about the corridor." 3 minutes later, 1 word. Yes. Tuesday, I went to school. The hallways felt thin, like a set someone was about to strike. Half my students were absent. The ones who came sat with their phones under their desks, refreshing feeds, and I didn't stop them because I'd done the same thing in the faculty bathroom between periods. The principal held an assembly about staying informed but not afraid, which managed to accomplish neither. My colleague, Brian Aldis, who taught AP biology and had a calm, clinical way of processing information that I envied, stopped me in the hallway after a 3rd period. "You see the preprint out of Johns Hopkins?" "I don't read preprints, Brian." "You should read this one. The pathogen, whatever it is they're calling it. A protozoal neural hybrid. Not bacterial, not viral. Something that colonizes the limbic system and essentially hijacks motor function while dissolving higher cognition. The infected aren't dead, Daniel. They're running on a stripped-down operating system. Hunger, pursuit, nothing else." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the paper also says the metabolic demand is unsustainable. The organism is burning the host's caloric reserves at roughly 8 times the normal rate. Without food intake, and the infected don't eat in any organized way, the host body fails in 10 to 21 days. So it burns itself out. In theory, but in practice, the infection rate is outpacing the burnout rate. Every host creates 6 to 10 new hosts before it collapses. The math doesn't resolve until the density of uninfected drops below the encounter threshold. I leaned against the cinder block wall and tried to breathe in a way that didn't feel performative. What's the encounter threshold? Rural isolation, low population density, places where an infected can collapse in a field without finding the next person. Like Eastern Kentucky. Ryan looked at me carefully. You have somewhere to go, don't you? I didn't answer. But when I got home that evening, I pulled my father's waterproof map from the glove box and taped it inside the back cover of my 1998 edition of Howard Zinn, which I kept on the shelf above the dryer because Shonda had always refused to touch it. Then I called her. I need the girls Thursday. Shonda was quiet for 3 seconds, which was her version of a scream. It's my week, Daniel. I know, I'm asking. You're not asking. You're telling with polite grammar. What's going on? I sat on the edge of my bed, the phone pressed to my ear, and tried to figure out how to say what I needed to say without sounding like my father. Because the thing about Warren Maddox's worldview was that it was coherent, airtight, even, and the moment you started articulating it to someone who lived inside normal assumptions, you became him. You became the man with the bunker map and the ammo cans, and the other person became your wife, backing toward the door. Have you been watching the news? Of course I've been watching the news. Everyone's watching the news. The school sent home a preparedness packet today, water, canned food, medications. It's like tornado protocol on steroids, but it's in Virginia and North Carolina, Daniel, not here. It's moving. According to who? Your father? The way she said it, not with contempt, but with the exhausted recognition of a pattern she'd already survived, made my ribs ache. According to Hopkins, according to the closure maps, I-81 is shut down. The Guard is deployed in 4 states. The CDC hasn't used the word contained since Sunday. Silence. I'm not saying the world is ending. I'm saying that if this gets worse, if it moves west, I want the girls somewhere defensible with supplies and distance from population centers. My dad's place is 3 hours from anything. He has provisions for weeks. He has guns, Daniel. He's had guns and provisions and a plan for the end of the world since before I met you. And every single time, the end of the world didn't come. This time there's video. She breathed. I could hear her loading the dishwasher, the small domestic sounds that had once been the background noise of my own life. If I say yes, what happens? I pick them up Thursday morning. We drive to the cabin. If nothing happens, I bring them back Sunday, and you never have to hear about it again. And if something does happen? Then they're in the safest place I know how to put them. With your father and his arsenal. With me. And yes, with him. The dishwasher closed. The silence changed weight. Lily will understand, she said. Nora won't. She'll cry the whole way because she has a play date Saturday with Gemma, and you'll have to explain why the world might be ending without actually saying the world might be ending. And you'll do it badly, because you always explain hard things like a textbook instead of like a dad. It stung because it was accurate. I'll do my best. That's what I'm afraid of. A pause. Fine. Thursday. But Daniel, if you take my daughters into those mountains and something goes wrong and you can't get them back to me, I will never. Her voice cracked. Just once. Like a single fracture in a pane of glass. She sealed it immediately. Just bring them home. I will. Wednesday, the infection crossed into Tennessee. Not the slow creep of a spreading illness, but a sudden, violent puncture. A tractor trailer on I-40 outside Knoxville. Jackknifed across 3 lanes, and when first responders arrived, The driver came out of the cab with most of his jaw missing and his hands already reaching. 7 responders were bitten in 4 minutes. The dashcam footage from a state trooper's vehicle showed the driver absorbing 2 center mass gunshots without changing stride, then dropping only when a 3rd round went through his skull. The governor of Kentucky activated the National Guard. I packed that night. Clothes for the girls, their medications, Nora's inhaler, Lily's iron supplements, books, Nora's wooden horse, a bag of trail mix and juice boxes for the drive. My own bag was smaller. Jeans, boots, thermal layers, the Zinn book with the map. I looked at my apartment, the basketball trophies from the team, the framed photo of the girls at Keeneland, the stack of ungraded papers, and understood that I was looking at it the way you look at a room you might not come back to. I set my alarm for 5. Thursday morning was beautiful in a way that felt like mockery gold light on the horse farms, mist in the low fields, the kind of Kentucky morning that postcards lie about because the real thing is better. I picked up the girls at 6. Shonda stood in the doorway in her bathrobe, arms crossed, and watched me load their bags into the trunk with the controlled stillness of a woman who had decided not to cry in front of her children. Nora bounced into the back seat, clutching a stuffed rabbit I hadn't seen before. Lily walked out slowly, carrying her own bag, and hugged her mother for a long time. 12 years old, and she already understood the grammar of departures that might not have returns. "Be good for your dad," Shonda said. Her eyes were on mine when she said it. The message was dual addressed. We were on the road by 6:20. Nora talked for the first 40 minutes about Gemma, about a caterpillar she'd found, about whether zombies were real. They're on the news, but Gemma says the news lies sometimes. Lily was silent, watching the landscape scroll, earbuds in, but nothing playing. I could see the screen. She was reading news feeds. "Dad," she said, "somewhere past Winchester. How bad is it really?" I'd rehearsed an answer, something calibrated, teacherly, designed to inform without terrifying. What came out was different. Bad enough that Grandpa asked me to come, and bad enough that I listened. She nodded. This was enough. She'd always understood her grandfather better than I did, not his methods, but his seriousness. She trusted the weight of him, the way you trust a seawall without understanding hydrology. The drive should have taken 3 hours. It took 4 because Route 15 was choked with southbound traffic I'd never seen on a Thursday trucks. Loaded SUVs, a school bus with no markings. People were moving. Not panicking, not yet, but leaning into the geometry of escape, heading toward family land and rural distance the same way I was. I felt a strange, sick kinship with every loaded vehicle I passed. We turned onto the gravel road at 10:40. The cabin was visible from the last switchback, and even from that distance I could see my father had been working. The meadow had been altered, brush cleared from the lower fence line, creating an unobstructed view all the way to the road. The woodshed was restacked, squared off, and I recognized it now as a firing position with a concealed rear exit. The man had turned his retirement property into a fire base in less than a week, and he'd done it so cleanly that it still looked like a cabin in the woods. He was on the porch when we pulled in, standing the way he always stood, weight even, hands visible, scanning behind us for a following vehicle. When Nora burst out of the car and ran to him, something shifted in his face that I'd only seen 3 times in my life. His hand went to her hair. He closed his eyes for half a second. "Grandpa, I brought my rabbit." "I see that. Good rabbit. Does it have a name?" "Captain Stompers." "Outstanding. Captain Stompers is welcome in this command. He looked at me over her head. You made good time. Traffic on 15. It'll be worse tomorrow. By Saturday, the state routes will be impassable. He set Nora down. Lily, come here. Lily walked to him with the careful dignity of a girl navigating the space between childhood and something harder. He put a hand on her shoulder. You're going to hear things in the next few days. Some from the radio, some from me. If anything I say doesn't make sense, you ask. Don't swallow what you don't understand. Clear? Clear, Grandpa. He looked at me again. And for the first time I saw something besides certainty. I saw relief. Not that the crisis was manageable, but that the pieces he needed were now inside his perimeter. His son, his granddaughters, the supplies in the ground, the sight lines trimmed. The calculation was complete. Let's get inside, he said. We have work to do before dark. I carried the bags in and did not look back at the road. My father's preparation inside the cabin was surgical. The main room, the open space with the wood stove, the pine table, the kitchen along the back wall, had been reorganized into zones. A communication station in the northeast corner, shortwave radio, 2 handhelds, a battery bank connected to a solar panel he'd mounted on the south-facing eave. A medical station along the east wall, the field trauma bag from the buried supplies, now open and inventoried, with a laminated quick reference card he'd made listing dosages and wound care protocols. The kitchen had been restocked with water not from the well, but sealed 5-gallon jugs he'd rotated in over the past month. Water table's good here, he said, but if this lasts more than 2 weeks and the county pumping station fails, the well goes manual. I installed a hand pump housing in March. You installed a hand pump in March. Seemed prudent. Nora was already exploring, her attention magnetized by the strangeness of a familiar place made new. Lily sat at the pine table and opened the laminated medical card and started reading it. She was 12. She was reading triage protocols the way other 12-year-olds read manga. Dad, what's the plan? He unfolded a topographic map of the surrounding area. Not a commercial map, but something he'd annotated by hand over years. Every trail, every drainage, every neighboring property marked with names, distances, and notes I couldn't fully decipher. Perimeter is the property line. 43 acres. North and east are ridge natural barrier, too steep for approach except at 2 saddle points here and here. He tapped. South is the meadow, open ground. West is the gravel road, single access. If anything comes, it comes from the south or west. Anything meaning people? Anything meaning anything. People, infected, both. In the early phase, there's no functional difference. Anyone moving toward you at speed is a threat until proven otherwise. Dad, we're not at war. He looked at me with an expression that didn't argue because it didn't need to. No, but we might be under siege. Siege rules are simpler. You hold what you have. You don't go out to meet what's coming. You let distance and terrain do the work. That afternoon, while Nora napped on the couch and Lily read, my father and I recovered 4 of the buried caches. He moved slowly, his knee was worse than he'd admitted, and twice I saw him grip a tree trunk to absorb weight during the downhill walk. We brought back 2 rifles, ammunition, the water purification system, and a case of MREs. He assembled 1 rifle on the kitchen table with the unconscious fluency of a man tying his shoes, then held it out to me. You're going to zero this tomorrow morning. 200 yards, standing and prone. In front of the girls. Lily needs to know what this sounds like, so she doesn't panic when she hears it for real. Nora will cover her ears and ask if she can try. You'll say no. I'll say later. will both mean no. I took the rifle. It was lighter than I expected and heavier than anything I wanted to hold in the same house as my children. The weight was not physical. It was directional. It pointed toward a version of the future I had spent my entire adult life refusing to enter. "There's something else," he said. He reached under his bunk and pulled out a shorter case. Inside was a handgun, a Beretta M9, standard military sidearm, well used. "This stays on you, not in a drawer, not in a bag. On your belt, loaded, safety on, from the moment you wake up to the moment you sleep. Even then, it's within arm's reach." "I'm a high school teacher, Dad." "You're a father in a situation that is going to require more than lesson plans. The pistol is a tool. Learn it the way you learn to drive. Automatically, without admiration, without dread." I holstered the Beretta. It sat against my hip like a new organ, awkward and vital and completely unwelcome. Nora woke from her nap, saw it, and said, "Daddy has a belt thing." "Yes, he does, sweetheart." "Is it a phone holder?" "Something like that." Lily looked at me from across the room and didn't ask. By Friday morning, the national situation had passed through the membrane between crisis and catastrophe so quietly that if you weren't watching the specific metrics, you might have thought it was still manageable. The networks were still broadcasting. The president gave another address. FEMA was distributing supplies in Virginia. But the underlying numbers, which Brian Aldis texted me in a single clinical paragraph at 2:17 a.m., told a different story. Infection had reached 14 states. The doubling rate was 31 hours. The National Guard was deployed in overlapping jurisdictions that were already competing for resources. And 3 field hospitals had been overrun by patients who arrived sick and left the building hungry. My father had been monitoring his shortwave frequencies with the patient discipline of a man reading tide charts. He kept a logbook, timestamps, frequencies, call signs, content summaries. Most of it was amateur operators sharing local conditions, road closures, population movements, scattered reports of infected sightings in areas that the official maps still listed as clear. But one frequency carried a different kind of traffic, structured, coded, military cadence transmissions that my father listened to without comment and logged with a separate pen. "What are those?" I asked. "Old network, people I served with. We set up a communication protocol in 2011 for exactly this kind of event. You and your Army buddies have a doomsday radio network. We have a situational awareness grid. The terminology matters." "Dad, the terminology does not matter." "It does to the people transmitting. Sergeant First Class Rena Delgado is 60 miles south in Harlan County with her daughter and 2 grandchildren. She's reporting that infected have been sighted on Route 421. Master Sergeant Tom Washburn is outside Pikeville with a compound of 11 people. He says the interstate is now fully blocked by abandoned vehicles, and at least 200 infected are moving through the corridor on foot. These aren't abstractions, Daniel. These are positions on a map that I can now plot." He was right. And I hated that he was right. Because the moment I accepted his framework, I lost mine. I was no longer a cautious father humoring his paranoid dad. I was a man inside a perimeter with a pistol on his hip, plotting threat vectors on a hand-drawn map while his 7-year-old colored pictures of Captain Stompers at the kitchen table 10 feet away. I zeroed the rifle that morning. My father set a target against the hillside at 200 yards and stood behind me with binoculars, calling adjustments. The recoil was sharper than I remembered from the .22 of my childhood, a hard declarative shove that said, "This is not a sport." After 40 rounds, I was grouping inside 4 inches, My father said nothing, which was his version of adequate. Lily watched from the porch. Nora was inside with her ears covered and the door closed, singing to her rabbit. When I came back up the steps, Lily said, "You're pretty good." "I'm passable." "Grandpa's better." "Grandpa's been doing this since before I was born." "Are we going to need it?" "The shooting." I looked at my daughter and made a choice I'd later examine from every angle. I told her the truth. "Probably yes." Her face didn't change. Something behind it did a tectonic adjustment, a plate shifting, and she nodded once and went inside. That afternoon, we heard the first sounds. It came from the south, from the direction of the old Parsons farm 2 miles down valley. A series of sharp cracks, gunfire, semi-automatic, rapid followed by silence, then a single shot, then silence again. My father was already on the porch with binoculars before I processed what I'd heard. "Parsons' place," he said. Jack Parsons was 83 and lived alone. Someone either found him or he found them. "Should we?" "No." The word was a door closing. "We don't go to the sound. We never go to the sound. If someone needs help, they come to us. If they come infected, we see them across the meadow at 300 yards. If they come human, we talk at the tree line. Nobody enters the cabin perimeter without my authorization. That's survival. The word you're looking for is survival." I didn't say the word I was actually looking for, which was isolation, which was abandonment, which tasted like bile in a mouth I was learning to keep shut. Saturday brought people. The first was a woman named Claire Mosley, early 40s, hiking up the gravel road at mid-morning with a backpack and a pronounced limp. My father spotted her from the porch at 600 yards and tracked her through binoculars for 5 minutes before announcing she was unarmed and uninfected. "Gate protocol," he said. "I stay on the porch. You meet her at the tree line. Side visible, weapon holstered but present. Assess her condition. Do not invite her inside." "Dad, she's limping." "She's ambulatory. Go." I walked down the meadow, feeling absurd and monstrous in equal measure, the Beretta on my hip, the morning dew soaking my boots, the sun gentle on the back of my neck, while I went to meet a stranger like a checkpoint guard. Claire Mosley stopped at the tree line when she saw me. Her face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed, her left ankle wrapped in a compression bandage that had been applied by someone who knew what they were doing. "I'm not sick," she said immediately. "I'm not bitten. I twisted my ankle on a culvert 2 miles back. I'm trying to get to my sister's place in Owsley County, and my car died on Route 11. "Route 11 is accessible?" "It was yesterday. I've been walking since dawn." She looked past me at the cabin. "I don't want to come in. I just need water and a direction." Something in the way she said, "I don't want to come in," the preemptive surrender of a woman who'd already been turned away, made something crack in me. I gave her 2 water bottles and a compass bearing for Owsley County that avoided the main roads. My father would have stopped there. I added a handful of MRE packets and a chemical heat pouch from my jacket. "Thank you," she said. Then, "There are infected on Route 421. I saw 3 of them outside a gas station near Manchester. They were standing still, just standing, not moving, not chasing anything. But when a car came through, they turned at the same time, like deer hearing a branch snap. And then they ran." "How fast?" "Faster than you want to know." She left. I watched her disappear down the road, limping with the stubborn rhythm of a woman who understood that stopping was death. I walked back up to the cabin, feeling like I'd passed a test I didn't want to take. The second arrival was harder. Early afternoon, a man and a boy, maybe 10 years old, coming not from the road, but from the east ridge, the steep approach my father had marked as defensible. They'd climbed it. The man was carrying the boy on his back, and even from the porch I could see the man's shirt was dark with blood. My father had the rifle shouldered before I could speak. "Dad, the blood. Look at the blood pattern." I looked. The man's left arm was wrapped in torn fabric. The blood had soaked through in a pattern that radiated from a single point on his forearm. A bite. "He's been bitten," my father said, and his voice held no anger, no cruelty, only the flat arithmetic of a man performing a calculation that had one answer. "He's carrying a child." "Yes, and in 6 to 18 hours, based on every piece of data we have, he will no longer be carrying that child. He will be pursuing that child." The man reached the tree line and collapsed to his knees. The boy slid off his back and stood beside him, small hands gripping his father's uninjured arm. The man looked up toward the cabin, and I saw his face, mid-30s, dark-haired, terrified, and aware. He knew what the bite meant. He'd known it while he climbed the ridge with his son on his back. "Please," he called. His voice was raw. "Not for me, for my boy. Just take my boy." Nora appeared at the cabin window, pressing her face against the glass, looking down at the meadow where a man knelt in the grass begging a stranger to take his son. My father said, "Daniel." I said, "I know." I walked down to meet them. His name was Garrett. The boy was Micah. He told me this while kneeling in the grass with his hand pressed against the bandage on his forearm, applying pressure less from medical instinct than from the need to hold the wound closed the way you'd hold a door shut against something trying to get in. "We were in Hyden," he said. 3 of them came through the Dollar General parking lot. I got Micah into the truck, but one of them, she was maybe 60 years old. Daniel, she was somebody's grandmother. She came through the passenger window before I could get the door closed. She bit my arm. I pulled her off. We drove until the truck ran dry, and then we walked. How long ago? The bite? About 14 hours? 14 hours. Brian's data said onset ranged from 6 to 24, depending on the host's immune response. Garrett was still lucid, still articulate, still gripping his son's shoulder with the careful pressure of a man afraid his own hands might change purpose. Micah hadn't spoken. He stood with the absolute stillness of a child who had processed something beyond his developmental capacity and had responded by becoming very, very small. His eyes were dry, his face was blank. He held his father's arm and did not let go. "I know what's happening to me," Garrett said. "I can feel it starting. There's a heat in my head, behind my eyes, like a migraine that has a direction. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you to save him." I looked back at the cabin. My father stood on the porch with the rifle across his chest, watching, not aiming, waiting for me to decide. This was the architecture of his parenting. He had never told me what to do in a crisis. He had placed me inside the crisis and watched what I built. Every fishing trip, every camping week, every hard silence. After a mistake, it was all the same pedagogy. "I have given you the tools. Now show me who you are." "Micah comes inside," I said. "You don't. I'm sorry." "I know." Garrett's eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "I know. Can I have 10 minutes? Just to talk to him, to explain." "You can have 10 minutes. What happened next is something I carry in a place I don't access often." Garrett knelt in front of his son and spoke quietly for 8 minutes. I stepped back far enough to give them privacy and close enough to react if the infection accelerated. I heard fragments. "Be brave and listen to the man. and I'm going to go somewhere else now, but not because I want to. And each fragment was a nail driven into a structure I recognized. Because I was a father too. And the architecture of goodbye is universal. Micah spoke once. Where will you go? Into the woods, away from here. So you're safe. But who will keep you safe? Garrett's face collapsed for exactly 1 second. He rebuilt it. This was the bravest thing I have ever seen a human being do. I'll be okay, buddy. The trees will keep me. He stood up. He kissed the top of Micah's head. He looked at me with eyes that were starting to show something wrong. A faint yellowish tint in the sclera, a slight delay in the dilation of his pupils. His mother is dead, Garrett said. There's nobody else. Please. I've got him. Garrett turned and walked toward the western tree line. He did not look back. Micah watched him go with the silence of a boy who had just learned that the worst thing in the world was not a monster, but a door closing behind someone you loved. I took Micah's hand. It was cold and rigid. I led him up to the cabin. My father lowered the rifle and stepped aside without a word. Inside, Nora looked at Micah and said, "Do you want to hold Captain Stompers? He's soft and he doesn't talk." Micah took the rabbit. He held it against his chest. He sat on the couch and stared at the wall and did not cry, and the absence of crying was worse than any sound I had ever heard in my life. That night, my father and I sat on the porch after the children were asleep. Nora in my bunk, Lily in a sleeping bag on the floor, Micah on the couch with Captain Stompers still pressed to his sternum. The mountains were dark in a way that cities never are. A total darkness that reclaimed the landscape, like water filling a basin. No highway glow on the horizon. No aircraft lights. The grid was dying, county by county, and the darkness was its funeral. "You made the right call," my father said. Not gently, not warmly. As a factual assessment, the way he'd say the rifle was zeroed or the water was clean. Did I? I sent a man into the woods to die alone. You took his son. That's what he asked for. And if Garrett comes back, if he turns and remembers the direction? He won't remember direction. The cognitive literature is clear. Navigational memory is one of the first systems the pathogen strips. He'll wander radially from wherever the transition occurs. Random walk, no targeting. You've been reading cognitive literature about this. I've been reading everything about this for 3 months. I let that sit. 3 months. While I was coaching basketball and grading papers and arguing with Shonda about Christmas schedules, my father had been tracking a pathogen across classified and open-source channels, building caches, fortifying a cabin, and installing a hand pump on a well, all without telling me, because telling me would have required a conversation he didn't trust me to have. Why didn't you warn me sooner? He was quiet for a long time. An owl called from the ridge. The shortwave inside crackled with a transmission he didn't move to log. Because you would have argued. You would have said I was catastrophizing. You would have used the word paranoid. And by the time I convinced you, the window would have closed. You don't know that. I know you, Daniel. You are a good man who requires evidence before action. That's a virtue in a classroom. In a collapsing system, it's a lethal delay. I couldn't afford to spend 2 weeks proving the case, so I prepared the ground and gave you 48 hours to decide. That's manipulative. Yes. The honesty winded me. My father had never pretended to be fair. He had only ever pretended to be right. And the distance between those two things was the entire geography of our relationship. The girls need structure, I said. Because I needed to talk about something I could control. Nora's going to start asking when we're going home. Lily already knows we're not. Micah is... I stopped. Micah is in shock. He needs more than I can give him. He needs routine. Food, sleep, tasks. Small children in crisis need the scaffolding of normalcy even when the content is gone. Give him chores. Teach him something. Let him be useful. He's 10. You could field strip a rifle at 10. And look how well adjusted that made me. The faintest crack at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. An acknowledgement that the joke had landed. Then the radio inside squawked, and a voice I hadn't heard before, female, tight, controlled, spoke on my father's coded frequency. Long Shadow, this is Ridgeline. Position compromised. Moving north with 2 miners. Request approach on your eastern saddle. E.T. Dawn. Confirm safe passage. My father stood immediately and crossed to the radio. He picked up the handset with the precision of a man who had been waiting for exactly this call. Ridgeline, Long Shadow confirms. Eastern saddle approach approved. Challenge is Copperhead. Response is Ridgeback. Do not deviate from the game trail. Traps are active on the North Fork. Copy, Long Shadow. Ridgeline out. He set down the handset and looked at me. That's Rena Delgado. She was 60 miles south yesterday. If she's moving north at night with children, her position didn't hold. How many did she say? 4, 2 miners. Dad, we have 3 children in there already and supplies for 6, calculated for 30 days. We're at 5 now. We'll be at 9 by morning. That changes the math from 30 days to 17. 17 days. The infected burnout window was 10 to 21. The margins were going to eat us. Rena Delgado came through the eastern saddle at first light with her 14-year-old daughter Alma, her daughter's friend Becca, who was 16, Rena's neighbor Dale Worthy, who was 60 and moved with the cautious gait of a man navigating knee-deep water, and Dale's dog, a brindle pit mix named Turk, who padded up to the cabin porch and sat down like he'd been assigned the post. Rena herself was exactly what my father's voice became when he talked about the people he'd served with. Compact, efficient, her gray-streaked hair pulled back, her movements calibrated to waste nothing. She carried a hunting rifle and a medical bag, and she assessed the cabin, the perimeter, the children, and me in a single sweep that lasted about 4 seconds. You're Daniel, she said. Not a question. Warren's son. I know who you are. He talks about you on the net. Always my son, the teacher. Says it like a rank. She extended her hand. Her grip was calloused and exact. Your father saved my life in Kandahar in 2009. Figured I'd return the favor by not dying on his porch. My father embraced her. Actually embraced her arms around her shoulders, a firm pressure that lasted 2 full seconds. I had not seen him embrace another human being since my mother's funeral. What happened at your position? Horde, maybe 40, moving through the valley along the creek bed. They hit the Bowman farm first. We heard the screaming around midnight. I had 20 minutes to grab the girls, get Dale, and move. We hiked the ridge trail in the dark, lost the secondary trail near the summit, and bushwhacked for 2 hours. Becca fell and opened her shin on limestone. I sutured it in the field. She said this the way I would describe a commute with unexpected traffic. The addition of 4 people and a dog transformed the cabin's internal dynamics overnight. Space that had felt adequate for 5 became compressed for 9. My father recalculated everything: water consumption, caloric intake, sleeping arrangements, the latrine schedule he'd established behind the woodshed. He did this on paper, with columns. And when he finished, he said, We can sustain this for 16 days if no one gets injured or ill. 15 if the dog stays. The dog stays, Dale said, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep and soft and had the particular weight of a man who had absorbed a lifetime of loss and had decided that the dog was his line. The dog stays, my father agreed. And I saw something I'd never seen in him, the willingness to absorb an inefficiency, because the human cost of refusing it was higher than the caloric math. Rena took over the medical station with the authority of someone reclaiming a desk. She inventoried every item, reorganized the trauma bag, and examined each person in the cabin with clinical thoroughness. Micah submitted to her examination with the passive compliance of a child who had given up on autonomy. Nora talked through hers. Lily asked questions about suture technique that Rena answered with the respect she'd give a peer. "The boy," Rena said to me privately while the children ate. "Who is he?" "His name is Micah. His father was bitten. He walked him here and then walked into the woods." Rena processed this with a single, slow blink. "He's not eating enough. And he hasn't spoken more than 5 words since I arrived." "I know." Acute stress response in children his age can transition to selective mutism if the underlying trauma isn't addressed. He needs a specific adult attachment, one person who is consistently present and who doesn't ask him to talk about what happened. "I'm trying." "Try harder. Not with effort, with proximity. Sit next to him. Do tasks beside him. Don't fill the silence. Let him choose when the silence ends." That afternoon, I brought Micah to the woodpile and handed him a small hatchet. I showed him how to split kindling, where to place the blade, how to let the weight of the tool do the work. We split wood for an hour without speaking. At the end, he stacked his pile neatly, looked at what he'd built, and said, "More?" One word. It was the most beautiful sound I'd heard since the world ended. By the 5th day, the shortwave had become our only reliable connection to the world beyond the property. My father's network, the coded frequency, the old soldiers and their families provided a patchwork map of conditions that was both more granular and more terrifying than anything the official channels had offered before they went silent. The last commercial broadcast we received was a pre-recorded FEMA loop on AM 630, advising citizens to shelter in place and await further instructions. It played for 6 hours straight without variation, then cut to static. Nobody was coming to give further instructions. The map my father maintained on the cabin wall, hand-drawn, annotated with grease pencils, showed the infection's progression as a series of concentric pressure zones. The densest concentrations were along the interstate corridors and population centers. Rural areas were sparser but not safe infected, followed sound and movement. And any noise source could redirect a wandering cluster. The horde that had hit Rena's position had likely been drawn by her generator. We had no generator. My father's cabin ran on propane, wood stove, and the solar panel that powered the radio and a single LED light. This was not an oversight. It was doctrine. Noise discipline, he said. And he meant it the way a seminary means scripture. 9 people in an 800-square-foot cabin with no electricity, limited water, and a shrinking food supply. This was the crucible that began to reveal who we actually were. Stripped of the identities we'd built in the world that no longer existed. Dale was quiet, methodical, and unexpectedly useful. He'd been a county road worker for 30 years and had the practical intelligence of a man who'd spent his life maintaining systems that smarter people designed and then forgot about. He fixed the cabin's failing gutter system with materials he found in the woodshed. He reinforced the outhouse. He rigged a rainwater collection barrel from a feed bucket and some tubing. He did all of this without being asked and without commentary, and Turk followed him everywhere like a quality inspector. Rena ran the medical and logistics operation with a competence that made my father visibly relax for the first time since I'd arrived. They communicated in a shorthand I couldn't parse, half military, half personal, built on decades of shared framework. When they disagreed, it was fast and specific. Water allocation should drop to half-gallon per person. Negative, dehydration risk with the children. Then we need the second cache by Wednesday. Resolved. Next item. I occupied the space between my father's command authority and Rena's operational competence. Not a leader, not a specialist, but the connective tissue. I cooked. I monitored the children. I split wood with Micah every morning and taught Lily and Alma basic orienteering in the afternoons, using the topo map and a compass. I mediated the small frictions that 9 people in close quarters inevitably generate. Nora's nightmares, Becca's silent weeping in the outhouse, Dale's insistence on feeding Turk from his own rations rather than the shared supply. On the 6th day, the first infected reached the meadow. My father saw it from the porch at 4:30 in the afternoon, a single figure moving across the open ground from the south, 500 yards out. He raised the binoculars and watched for 30 seconds. Male, approximately 40, significant deterioration. Clothing is hospital gown, 1 shoe. He's in the late stage. Movement is degraded. I looked through the binoculars. The figure moved with a lurching, inefficient stride, his head canted to one side, his arms not swinging, but fixed at his sides. He was thin gaunt, actually, the kind of thin that happens when a body consumes its own fuel without replacement. He was crossing the meadow at a diagonal, not heading toward the cabin, but intersecting its sight line by accident. "He'll pass," my father said. "Wind is wrong for him to catch scent or sound. Don't move. Don't speak above a whisper." We watched. 9 people held their breath while a single ruined figure walked across a meadow in the October light, casting a long shadow, heading nowhere, already dying from the inside. He reached the western tree line and disappeared. Nora had been watching from the window. "Daddy," she whispered, "was that a zombie?" "Yes, sweetheart." He looked sad. I had nothing to say to that, because she was right. The 7th day broke the first real fault line. The short wave brought a transmission from a family my father didn't know, a man identifying himself as Kevin, broadcasting on an open frequency, saying he was 8 miles southwest with his wife, his mother-in-law, and 2 children under 5. He was out of food. He'd heard my father's coded transmissions and had been triangulating the signal for 2 days. He was begging for coordinates. "Long Shadow, please. I know you're out there. I can hear you every night. We have children. They haven't eaten in 36 hours. Just give us a direction. We'll walk to you." My father turned off the radio. "No," he said. "Dad, we are at 9 people on 16 days of supplies. 2 additional adults, an elderly dependent, and 2 toddlers drops us to 9 days. Below the minimum burnout window. We would be committing to starvation for everyone in this cabin, including your daughters." He has children. I have grandchildren. The room split. Not loudly, there was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. It split the way ice splits, along invisible stress lines that had been forming since the first night. Rena said nothing, which I read as agreement with my father. Dale stared at the floor and rubbed Turk's ear. Alma and Becca exchanged a glance that carried the telepathic frequency of teenagers who had already decided the adults were failing. Lily looked at me, just looked, not asking me to do anything, measuring what I would do. I picked up the handset. "Don't," my father said. Not shouting, flat, a command. "I'm not giving him our coordinates. I'm giving him a direction." I keyed the mic. "Kevin, this is a relay station. I cannot provide a fixed position. Travel northeast on the ridge trail above Muncie Creek. There are abandoned hunting camps along the ridge at approximately 3-mile intervals. Some may have cached supplies. Do not travel the valley floor. Infected concentrate along waterways. Keep elevation. Copy?" Static. Then, "Copy. Thank you. Thank you. God bless you." I set down the handset. My father stared at me with an expression I had never seen on his face. Not anger, not disappointment, but something colder. Tactical reassessment. He was recalculating me as a variable in his system. And the recalculation had moved me from asset to risk. "If he follows the signal bearing instead of your direction, he walks straight to this cabin." I told him northeast. We're east-southeast. "You told a desperate man with starving children to walk in a direction that is 20 degrees off our actual position. 20 degrees at 8 miles is less than 3 miles of lateral error. If he drifts, if his compass is off, if he follows the terrain instead of the heading, then he arrives and we figure it out. There is nothing to figure out. There is food for 9 people for 14 more days, or food for 14 people for 8 days. One of those numbers survives. The other does not. You don't get to split the difference, because it makes you feel like a good person." The cabin was silent. 3 children were listening. My father knew they were listening, and he did not lower his voice, because Warren Maddox did not believe in protecting children from arithmetic. He believed in teaching them to count. I stepped outside. The evening air was cold, carrying the first edge of real autumn. I walked to the woodpile and stood there with my hands shaking, not from the temperature. Rena followed me out. "He's not wrong," she said. "I know. But you're not wrong either. The problem isn't the math. The problem is that your father only speaks in math. And you only speak in whatever the opposite of math is. Morality. I was going to say stubbornness, but sure. Despite everything, I almost laughed. "The family won't find us," she said. "Your misdirection was good. But your father now knows you'll pick up the radio. That changes what he trusts you with." She was right. When I went back inside, the handset had been removed from the communication station. I didn't ask where it was. I already knew in my father's bunk, under his pillow, next to the pistol he slept with. The 2 instruments he considered most dangerous in untrained hands. On the 9th night, the horde came. Not a single wanderer crossing the meadow by accident. A mass, Rena counted them through the night scope she'd brought from Harlan, moving through the valley below the property in a loose, directionless stream, following the creek bed the way water follows a channel. 31 visible in the first pass, then more behind them, emerging from the tree line in clusters of 3 and 4, all moving with the same degraded, mechanical gait. All silent, except for a sound Rena described as wet respiration, like a dog panting through fluid. My father had planned for this. The cabin's elevation, 400 feet above the valley floor, and the density of the surrounding timber made direct approach difficult. The meadow was the vulnerability, and he'd considered it. They follow sound, movement, and possibly scent, though the scent data is inconsistent, he whispered. We were on the porch, all 3 adults, weapons ready. Inside, Lily had been assigned to keep the younger children silent and on the floor. She'd accepted this task with a gravity that made her look 30. The protocol is total noise discipline. No light, no movement, no speech above a whisper. If they divert uphill, We have the meadow as a firing zone. 200 yards, clear sight line. You want to shoot them? I want them to pass. If they don't pass, I want to shoot the lead elements to create a barrier that redirects the rest. Infected will navigate around a fallen body they don't recognize their own, but they register an obstacle. We waited. I have never experienced silence the way I experienced it that night. Not as the absence of sound, but as a material substance. Something with weight and pressure that filled the lungs and made every heartbeat feel like a drum strike. I could hear Nora's breathing through the cabin wall. I could hear Turk's nails on the floorboards as Dale held his muzzle shut. The horde moved through the valley for 2 hours. The leading edge passed below us and continued northeast. The trailing clusters spread wider, some drifting toward the slope. And for 19 minutes, a group of 6 moved uphill through the timber, climbing toward the meadow. My father tracked them through the scope. His finger rested along the trigger guard, not on the trigger. The disciplined index of a man who had been trained to distinguish between preparation and commitment. At 100 yards, one of them stopped. A woman, young, her clothing torn, her head moving in the slow rotational scan I'd seen on the Virginia footage weeks ago. She was orienting, testing the air or the sound or whatever degraded sensory apparatus the pathogen had left her. My father's finger moved to the trigger. "Wait," Raina whispered. She pointed. Below the woman, the other 5 had stopped as well. They stood motionless in the timber, heads tilted, a frozen tableau that looked almost like listening. Then distantly, from the northeast, a sound. A car horn. Someone, miles away, was leaning on a car horn in long, desperate blasts. The 6 infected turned, all at once, with that synchronized pivot that made your spine contract, and moved downhill, away from us, toward the sound. Within 4 minutes, they were back in the valley stream, absorbed into the mass, heading northeast toward whoever was pressing that horn. My father's finger returned to the guard. He exhaled. "Someone just died to save us," I said. "Someone just died." He didn't add the rest. He didn't frame it as sacrifice or luck or providence. It was a data point. Someone had made noise, and the noise had redirected a threat vector. Whether they'd done it deliberately or in panic was irrelevant to the outcome. But it wasn't irrelevant to me. It wasn't irrelevant to the architecture of a world where survival was determined not by merit or justice, but by who was louder and who was quieter. In that architecture, virtue was silence, and the noisiest person was always the sacrifice. I went inside. Nora was asleep in Lily's arms on the floor. Micah was awake, sitting upright in the dark, holding Captain Stompers, his eyes open and fixed on the door. "Are they gone?" he asked. "They're gone, buddy. My dad went into the woods." "I know. Is he one of them now?" The truth sat in my mouth like a stone. I swallowed it. "I don't know, Micah. But you're here, and I've got you." Day 12 brought the collapse of my father's body and the exposure of something he'd been hiding since before I arrived. He fell in the morning, walking the perimeter, a routine he'd maintained every dawn and dusk since the beginning. Rena heard the fall from the medical station and was outside before I'd processed the sound. I found them at the tree line, my father on his back, Rena kneeling beside him, her fingers on his carotid. His pulse is arrhythmic. Help me get him inside. We carried him. He weighed less than I expected, less than a man his size should weigh. And that was the first clue. Inside, Rena examined him with the controlled urgency of a medic who already suspected the diagnosis. "Warren, how long have you been symptomatic?" "Define symptomatic." "The chest pain, the shortness of breath on incline, the night sweats I've noticed you covering with extra blankets. How long? A silence that recalibrated everything. 18 months. Diagnosed at the VA in Lexington. Congestive heart failure, stage 3. Prescribed medication I stopped filling 2 months ago because the pharmacy supply chain was already degrading. The room rearranged itself around this information the way a room rearranges after an explosion. The same objects in new positions, nothing where you left it. My father had a terminal diagnosis. He had known it when he called me. He had known it when we buried the supplies. He had known it when he handed me the Beretta and told me to wear it at all times. The supplies weren't for him. They were never for him. They were inheritance, practical, operational, buried in the ground instead of locked in an attorney's office. The cabin, the caches, the perimeter, the entire architecture of survival he'd built. It was a will, witnessed by no one, filed in the earth. "You son of a bitch," I said, and meant it as the most honest description I'd ever given him. Language, Daniel. The children. You brought me here to hand me a job you knew you couldn't finish. I brought you here because the job needs finishing, and you're the only one I trust to finish it. You don't trust me. You told me that 2 days ago when you took the radio. I don't trust your impulses. I trust your competence. There's a difference, and you're old enough to understand it. Rena intervened before the conversation could reach whatever destination my anger was driving toward. She administered the remaining cardiac medication from the medical supplies, a limited quantity, enough for perhaps 10 days at reduced dosage, and confined him to the cabin. No perimeter walks, no lifting, no stairs. You monitor the radio and you teach Daniel whatever else he needs to know, because the operational transition is happening now, not when you're ready. My father accepted this the way he accepted all things, as a condition to be managed, not a defeat to be mourned. Within an hour, he was seated at the communications station, walking me through the short-wave protocols, the coded frequency rotation schedule, the contact roster, the cairn map, the water system maintenance, the firing positions, the emergency evacuation route along the eastern ridge that led to a Forest Service road 14 miles north. If the cabin is overrun, you take the children up the eastern saddle. You do not stay and fight. Fighting is for when you have something to gain. Retreat is for when you have something to protect. Dad, listen to me. You have spent your adult life quietly building yourself into the opposite of what I am. That was appropriate for the world you lived in. It is not appropriate for this one. You're going to have to become something that feels wrong to you. Something that uses the parts of me you tried to amputate. And you're going to have to do it while your daughters watch, because they need to see that becoming hard does not require becoming cruel. He held my gaze. That's the only thing I got wrong in my life, Daniel. I never learned to be hard without being cruel. You're smarter than me. Figure it out. I sat at the pine table across from my dying father and understood, for the first time, that his entire life had been a rough draft of the lesson he was now delivering. Day 15 was when I stopped being my father's son and started being whatever this new thing was. Not a leader, not a soldier, not a commander, but something without a title. The person who decides, the one who stands in the gap between what the group needs and what the group can stomach, and absorbs the distance. My father could no longer walk to the porch. Rena managed his medication, but the trajectory was visible to everyone, including Nora, who had started bringing him drawings and sitting beside his bunk while he looked at them with the careful attention he'd once reserved for maps. The shortwave traffic had changed. Where previous days had been scattered reports from isolated groups, the last 48 hours brought a new pattern. Silence, Frequencies that had been active went dead. Not static dead. Clean silence where a voice had been. My father's logbook showed the attrition. Washburn and Pikeville, gone on day 11. A family in Bell County, gone on day 13. One by one, the nodes in his network were winking out. But a few transmissions carried a different message. A woman near Berea reported that the infected in her area had stopped moving, not dead collapsed. She found 3 of them in a ditch along Route 21, still breathing but immobile, their bodies emaciated, their eyes open but untracking. The metabolic burnout Brian had described, the timer running down. "It's happening," Rena said, reading the log. "The self-consumption is accelerating in the late-stage population. First wave infected are failing." First wave. What about the subsequent waves? Shorter infection chains burn faster. The second generation infected had fewer available hosts, which means less replenishment, which means faster collapse. The math is logarithmic. If the first wave peaks at 21 days, the second peaks at 14, the third at 9. So we're looking at what? Another week? For this region, the density here was always low. In the cities, she trailed off. The cities were a different arithmetic, and neither of us had the variables to solve them. I made the decision that morning to open the last caches. Not all of them, too, remained as emergency reserves, but the food, the remaining medical supplies, and the second water purification unit. My father didn't argue. He watched me draw the cache map from memory, check my recall against his written copy, and nod. "Perfect recall. You always did test well." "Dad, I swear to God." "Go. Take Dale. His knees are better than mine on the downhill." Dale and I retrieved the caches in 2 trips. The food extended our window by 11 days. The medical supplies included antibiotics that Rena immediately set aside for Becca, whose sutured shin had developed a redness she didn't like. The second water filter meant we could process creek water without relying solely on the well. That evening, I did something my father would never have done. I gathered everyone in the main room, all 9 of us, Turk included, and I told them the truth. All of it. The burnout timeline, the food calculation, my father's heart condition, the shrinking radio network, the fact that we were, in all probability, going to survive this, but that survival was going to require another 7 to 10 days of discipline, rationing, and silence. Lily asked, "What happens after?" "After we go outside, we assess the property, we figure out water, food production, security. We start building something that lasts longer than a supply cache." "Do we go home?" The question came from Nora, who was sitting on the floor with Micah, their shoulders touching in the unconscious way of children who had become siblings through proximity and shared terror. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. We'll find out together." Alma, Rena's daughter, spoke for the first time in days. "What about other people? There have to be other people who survived." "There are. And when it's safe, we'll find them." My father was listening from his bunk. He caught my eye across the room. His expression held nothing I could name. Not pride, not satisfaction, not vindication. Something quieter than any of those. Recognition, maybe. The look of a man watching a structure he'd framed being finished by someone with better hands. On day 19, I killed a man. He came from the south, across the meadow, in broad daylight. And he was not infected. He was human, armed, and moving with the purposeful stride of someone who had been watching us. He carried a hunting rifle and wore a blaze orange vest that stood out against the brown grass like a signal fire. I saw him from the porch at 300 yards. Rena was beside me. The children were inside. Human, Rena confirmed through binoculars. Armed, moving with intent. He's been observing. Look at his line. He's not wandering. He knows where the cabin is. Gate protocol, I said, and the words came out of my mouth, wearing my father's voice. I walked to the tree line. The man stopped at 80 yards and called out, "I know you've got supplies. I've been watching your smoke for 3 days. I've got a rifle, and I'm not leaving without food. We can do this friendly, or we can do it the other way." His voice was hoarse, and his face was hollow. And in another timeline, the one where I was still a history teacher with a sedan and a therapist, I would have seen a desperate man and felt compassion. In this timeline, I saw a threat vector with a rifle who had just told me he'd been conducting surveillance on a position containing 3 children. "I can give you 3 days of food," I said. "Set your rifle down and I'll bring it to the tree line." "I'm not setting anything down. Bring the food." I'm not walking toward a man with a raised weapon. Then I guess we've got a problem. The mathematics of the moment were simple. He was 80 yards away with a bolt-action rifle. I had the Beretta on my hip, effective range 50 yards. Generous. Behind me, on the porch, Rena had her hunting rifle. 200 yards, scoped. And she had been a combat veteran when I was still learning long division. I didn't signal her. I didn't need to. The shot came from the porch, passed close enough to the man's head that he flinched and dropped to a knee, and embedded in the tree behind him. A warning. Rena's warning. "Next one doesn't miss," Rena called. "Leave the rifle. Take 3 MRE packs from the tree line. Walk south. Don't come back." The man looked at me. I looked at him. And for a span of 2 seconds, I saw the calculation forming behind his eyes, the weighing of odds, the measurement of desperation against risk. He had children somewhere too, maybe. He had reasons that were as valid as mine. He raised the rifle. Rena's second shot was not a warning. It hit him in the chest, and he went backward into the grass and did not get up. The sound echoed off the ridge and came back to us in a diminishing series, each repetition softer until the valley absorbed it. I walked to him. He was dead. His eyes were open and his hand was still on the rifle, and in his vest pocket was a photograph of 2 girls, maybe 6 and 8, smiling in front of a Christmas tree. I took the photograph out and held it, and the world reduced itself to a single point of clarity. This was the cost. Not the infected, not the pathogen, not the horde in the valley or the burning metabolic countdown. This, a man with a photograph of his daughters, dead in my meadow, because the architecture of survival had compressed all of human morality into a single question, them or yours, and the answer was always yours. Always. And the person you became by answering it was someone your own children would eventually need to reckon with. I buried him at the western tree line. I kept the photograph. I didn't tell the children what had happened because Rena's shot had been explained as a warning fired at an approaching infected. And the lie was the last kindness I could offer any of them, including myself. That night, I sat on the porch with the photograph in my hand and my father's pistol on my hip. And I understood, finally, completely, and without any possibility of return, the thing he had tried to tell me my entire life. That protection and violence are not opposites. They are the same action, viewed from different positions. I put the photograph in the Zinn book next to the cache map and went inside. The infected collapsed over the next 6 days. We found them in the meadow, in the creek bed, along the gravel road, motionless, emaciated, their bodies folded into the landscape like abandoned machinery. The pathogen had consumed everything and left the chassis. Dale and I burned the remains in a fire that took 3 days and filled the valley with a sweet, acrid smoke that I can still taste when the wind shifts. My father died on day 26. Not from the infected, not from violence, but from the heart that had been failing since before any of this began. He died in his bunk at 3 a.m., with the logbook on his chest and the shortwave crackling softly beside him. Nora had fallen asleep next to him, and she woke me to say that Grandpa was very still and very cold, and she thought something had happened. Something had. We buried him behind the cabin, near the caches he'd placed in the ground for us. Lily read a passage from a book she'd found on his shelf. Micah placed a stone on the cairn without being asked. I am not the man I was. I am the man he built the plans for. My daughters are alive. His photograph is in my book beside the other father's photograph. I carry both.